semester anymore. The reason why I chose this topic for tonight's chat is because Central America has always been kind of a backwater. It's always been sort of this unknown space that's very close to the United States, but knowledge about it, historical knowledge and cultural knowledge about Central America is fairly lacking in the United States. And it's, as many of you know, we have the incredible Walton International Scholars Program here, and our student body is composed of about 8% Central American students. We have 60 of them here at all times on full scholarship. So I thought it might be appropriate to talk a little bit about Central America and also the role that the United States has played in Central America since the inception of these republics early in the 19th century. And that's the main reason. Now, remember, this talk is about the United States and Central America, so it's not really exclusively about Central American history. It's really that role that the U.S. has played in the past 200 years in the Isthmus. Basic outline is I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the founding fathers of the United States, their early perceptions of Latin America, then move on to the period in the 19th century, which is about territorial aggrandizement, and it was often done through filibustering, and we'll nail that term down. Then we'll talk a little bit about attitudes involved in filibustering and the ideological basis for filibustering. Then move on to the Panama Canal and how it was actually, a country was created to house a canal. From there, we'll look at the 20th century briefly, some of the terms like Banana Republic that everybody hears, but nobody really understands where it came from, what it means in this particular historical context. From there, we'll move to the Cold War period, talk a little bit about the U.S. and Central America during the Cold War, and then finally move toward the end to some of the U.S. foreign policy's primary goals during the Cold War and how they affect the wars that raged through Central America in the 1980s, and how those wars in the 1980s fueled this incredible exodus of Central Americans from the 80s all the way up to the current day, and the linkage between those conflicts that were actual civil wars and immigration to the United States. At the very end, I'd like to link this a little bit, situate anyway the Walton International Scholars Program, its origins, how it started, what was the context for it. I don't know if all of you are aware of that, some of you probably are, but it's quite interesting, and I think at a school like Ozarks, which is one of the three beneficiaries in Arkansas, along with Harding and John Brown University, of this incredible scholarship, that we should have a knowledge of where it came from and what was the context out of which it emerged. So we'll start with a little bit on the founding fathers and filibusters. Remember that inspiration for the independence movements in Latin America is largely not only a result of the American Revolution here in the United States and the French Revolution, but it's also inspired by the Enlightenment in general. But early on, the U.S. Political leaders, some of whom were the founding fathers, began to covet Spanish America and the potential for their independence as a possible region for territorial aggrandizement. Thomas Jefferson spoke of the expansion of the United States beyond our southern borders at the time, to include the entire continent, the entire hemisphere. You can believe that. John Adams was quoted as saying that Spanish America was ill-suited for democracy. There were many others that spoke of Latin America as being incapable of governance, of self-governance, incapable of actually forming republics that would be functional. it's interesting also to think about, how much the reverence that the independence leaders had for the United States, because it was the first country that shed colonial rule and became independent, right? And that request from the great South American liberator Simón Bolívar to the United States leaders at the time in the first 20 years, say around 1814, requests for aid to fight the Spanish, to achieve independence, were rebuffed on almost every occasion. Bolívar never got any help from the United States. None. He got more help when he went to Haiti to meet with General Pétion in Haiti in 1815. When his forces had been defeated on the battlefield, he was trying to regroup and reorganize and re-strategize a winning formula for Northern South America. He was advised to go see General Pétion, and General Pétion in Port-au-Prince immediately provided him with plenty of munitions, troops, ammunition, rest, and a strategy that would be really important. And that strategy was to enlist the help of people of color in Northern South America in his cause, and guarantee that upon achieving independence, they would be emancipated. Suddenly, his ranks swelled, the tide turned in his favor, and he began to win the war against the Spanish. That's important. The U.S. at the same time was not only rebuffing them because of these notions that I've already mentioned about incapability or incapacity to self-govern, but also because the U.S. wanted to placate Spain for the purchase of Florida. That was the prize, to purchase Florida, which is eventually purchased in 1819 in the Onus-Adams Treaty. But that was really the reason, and that a line was supposedly drawn with the purchase of Florida that nothing west of the Louisiana Purchase was going to happen to the Spanish holdings, which that's really not what happened. I mean, it continued. So this reluctance to help Spanish American liberators, the role of General Pétion in Haiti, I think it's fundamental. It's really important, and I think it's important for us to remember that Haiti was the first Latin American country to achieve independence in 1804, long before the Spanish-speaking countries or republics are actually get there. Let's move on to the filibuster. Does anyone know what a filibuster is? It's not a maneuver in Congress to hold some sort of legislation, and not in this context anyway. The way I usually describe it to students is it's a land pirate. That is, somebody that will just go into some other territory or land that's already been claimed by someone else, plant a U.S. flag, claim it, and try to occupy it for territorial aggrandizement purposes. This is going to be a tendency throughout the 19th century, and it's really abutted by the Monroe Doctrine by James Monroe, President James Monroe, which was declared in 1821, warning any European power to stay out of Latin America for reasons of colonization or recolonization. Remember that filibuster is a term that's going to be seen in a lot of different contexts. Some of the earlier forays from Georgia down into Florida were really filibustering forays. The western side of Florida, which extended all the way over past Mobile, all the way to the Louisiana border, all of that was filibustered in the early 19th century by U.S. Marauders, freebooters, filibusters. One of the early filibusters that I find fascinating is, and it shows up in Woody Allen film Bananas, is Hayden Edwards, who's created the state of Fredonia near Nacogdoches, Texas, in about 1830. and Mexican army was able to to expel him from this, but he declared it an independent republic long before the uprising against Mexico by the I don't know what to call them. I guess I would call the freebooters also those that fought at the Alamo. There was also a filibuster, Narciso Lopez, who was recruited by the United States to attack Cuba, which he did 2 times, and was defeated trying to acquire Cuba for the United States. A lot of this is in the context, remember, of by the 1820s and 30s, we're getting into the polemics of the Civil War and northern states coming in that are free, southern states that are coming in that are slaveholding. And Latin America was seen by some of these filibusters as a possible part of the world that could create another or could provide another slave state for the South. In 1823, Central America breaks away from Mexico. Mexico achieves her independence from Spain under General Iturbide in 1821. 2 years later, the Central American isthmus as a whole becomes independent. They break away from Mexico. And they create what's called the Central American Confederation. And that lasts until 1838. It's fairly a fascinating period. And many of you here know that the Central American Isthmus is comprised of 6 different countries, right? 5 of which are actually born after 1838. Because as long as the Confederation was in place, there was unity. The dream of liberals like Francisco Morazan in Honduras was a unified Central America. A Central America that would be strong, that would have secular education, would put limits on the church, and would try to modernize itself rapidly. That was the other side of that was the conservatives, because this was all a conflict between liberals and conservatives, who wanted to retain the characteristics of the colonial order. And their center was in Guatemala City, and their leader was Rafael Carrera. And so there was a lot of infighting, and there was never a consensus as to how the Central American Union could be created. It dissolved into factionalism, into regionalism, and the dream of Central American unification ended in 1838. So whenever it's interesting to think about, why is Central America 6 countries? What would it be like if it were united? It'd probably be as powerful as Mexico, economically anyway. And it just dissolved. And it was this factionalism, this ideological rift between liberals and conservatives at the time. Francisco Morazan lost his life fighting for the liberation, the unification of Central America. And it was resurrected several times later in the 19th century, the idea of Central American Union, and it never really achieved fruition, unfortunately, for Central America. It's interesting to think that, if you look at the map, Central America is really strategically situated as like the isthmus that divides the Caribbean from the Pacific Ocean, right? And if you look at the geography, it's rather thin. It lends itself to the dream of a canal, somehow some sort of transoceanic project that could link the Atlantic and the Pacific, right? These were ideas that were being thrown around in the 1830s, and they become even more urgent after the gold is discovered in California in 1849 gold rush. And of course, we don't have the Transcontinental Railroad in place until after the Civil War, right? So the only way to get from Boston to San Francisco is to take a boat to Panama and cross the isthmus on a canal, on a railroad that had just been built, or go to Nicaragua to the eastern coast where the San Juan River dumps into the Caribbean, go up the San Juan River to the Lake Nicaragua and cross a very thin spit of land to San Juan del Oriente, San Juan del Sur anyway, to take another ship out on the Pacific side. So the idea of a canal was in the air, and people and the British in the United States were competing for rights to build a canal. But those rights had to come through authorization from one of the countries. And Nicaragua, at the time in 1849, became this land of the fortune hunter. Cornelius Vanderbilt puts in a a steamboat transit system that goes up the San Juan River, across the lake, and takes people across to the Pacific coast so that they can shorten their journey. Can you imagine trying to cross the transcontinental United States without a railroad, just by horse? It would take probably at least a month or more. So this would cut that at least in half. And so Nicaragua becomes this flashpoint for the possibility of a canal, right? A transoceanic project. The British and the U.S. decide to recognize that if a canal is built, they will respect the right of the canal builder and there would be neutrality. Nobody had permission to do it yet. I want to give you just a little snippet of, the idea of territorial aggrandizement in Central America really begins about this time. The idea that perhaps Nicaragua could become a territory of the United States, because at the time, Nicaragua was the only Central American country that was colonized by two different colonial powers, Spain and Britain. The entire eastern side of Nicaragua was originally colonized by Britain, and it wasn't annexed into being a part of Nicaragua until the late 19th century. There was a land speculator. This is kind of interesting. This will give you an idea of what underlies this impulse for territorial aggrandizement within the United States, and it's in the context of manifest destiny, which many of you know what that is. There was a man named Henry Kinney who was actually the founder of the Texas Rangers in the mid-19th century, who tried to purchase 22 million acres of land in eastern Nicaragua for a colonization project that he had hoped would eventually become a state of the United States. And I'm going to quote, and this will give you a good idea of the prevailing attitudes toward Latin American peoples at the time. This was the New York Times correspondent in in the mid-1840s with respect to the future of Central America. He says, and I'll quote, "Central America is destined to occupy an influential position in the family of nations if her advantages of location, climate, and soil are veiled by a race of Northmen who shall supplant the tainted, mongrel, and decaying race which now curses it so fearlessly." So this, I think, in a nutshell, it sort of exemplifies attitudes towards Latin America within the United States. They were eminently racist. They were based on white supremacy, just as Manifest Destiny was. And that's what underlies the whole enterprise of filibustering. Now let's talk about one of probably the most famous filibuster of all time in Central America is a little short guy from Tennessee named William Walker, who he's soaking up all of these ideas in the 1840s and 50s, and he gets the idea to go to Sonora, Mexico, out from California, and invade Sonora, Mexico with an army of a couple of hundred men. And he does that, and plants the flag, and says this is now part of the United States, or it's an independent entity that will eventually become part of the United States. The Mexican army was able to extract him and get rid of him rather quickly. But at the same time in Nicaragua, there's a war raging between liberals and conservatives, and that happened all through Central America throughout the 19th century. And he was apparently, I don't know if this has actually been firmly established, invited by the liberals to bring an army to Nicaragua and help the liberal cause against the conservatives. Well, he ends up in Nicaragua with 110 men in 1855, and summarily subverts the invitation by cutting his ties with the liberals, and is able to, and you'd have to read books on it because it's rather complicated how he does it, but he seizes the country. He seizes Nicaragua. Nicaragua is an independent country, a republic at this time. He declares himself the president of Nicaragua. He reinstates slavery as an institution. The Nicaraguans had abolished slavery when they wrote their constitution in about 1839. And he declares English a language on par with Spanish as one of the official languages of the country. So you can see that there's an incredible sort of racist high-handedness behind this. I believe he was from Tennessee. I believe this was really, it's inextricably tied up in the South's desire to bring in more slave states. And I think that was probably what he was aiming for. Vanderbilt, who had created the transit company up the San Juan River to serve those who were going out to California, was an enemy of Walker because they got into this competition, and he mobilizes and funds an army to fight against Walker, and eventually Walker is expelled from Nicaragua, goes back to the United States, but he's not done. He goes back to the United States, recruits another army a second time, and tries to make it back to Nicaragua to renew his effort to control Nicaragua. Well, it so happens that he was intercepted by the British Navy near Trujillo, Honduras, which has, you know, a long northern Caribbean coast, and turned over to the Honduran authorities. They try him rather quickly, and they shoot him. He's firing squad right there, ending the chapter of Walker. But the experience of William Walker in Central America, I think, is really emblematic of an attitude. It's also, I think, illustrative of a certain way to, during the 19th century, this impulse for territorial aggrandizement. We don't even have to, cannot talk about the Mexican War. That's a whole other issue, but that's the biggest land heist in the history of probably the world. But the interpretation of Walker is within the context of Manifest Destiny, and that of the expansion of slave territories before the Civil War, right? That somehow these kind of ideas could be exported abroad and they could take root, you know, and bear fruit. And I think it's inseparable, really, from the intensifying conflict in the 1850s in the United States between Northern and Southern, the whole polemic that leads to the Civil War in 1860. So we also see that Central America is, because of its geographical location and its potential for the possible building of a canal, it is becoming more and more important geopolitically to the United States. And it's the dreams of a canal are linked to dreams of greater hegemony by the United States in the region at large, right? Remember that Walker, after his first foray into Nicaragua, I think it's worth noting anyway, that when he returned to the United States, he was hailed as a hero. They had parades and stuff. It was amazing. They had a Broadway play about him, and it was, here's this white supremacist that goes to a Central American country and basically takes over and reinstates slavery as an institution, and he's hailed as a hero of the United States. Not by everyone, obviously, but there were many that saw him as a crusading, marauding kind of freebooter that the United States could probably benefit from. And I think what's interesting also about it is the way that the Walker episode probably embeds itself in the historical imaginary of Nicaraguans, because he's still there. You ask anyone Nicaraguan today who William Walker is, and they know who William Walker is. So it's this idea of, the imperialist that comes down and wants to, take our land and tell us how to run things. So the impetus for a canal continues after the 1850s, right? The first to take a stab at it are the Colombians that offer a concession to Fernando Lesseps, who had built the Suez Canal and had been successful in building it. And the Colombians say, go for it. And this is, remember that Panama, if you can envision Panama in your mind, it's this little thin piece of land that connects the northern part of South America to Central America. And it was part of Colombia. It was part of Colombia. It was a province, the province of Panama. And anyway, Lesseps secures permission, authority to try to build the canal. He brings in many, many workers from the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean workers, to try and build this canal, but they were thwarted by the sheer difficulty of the project, and yellow fever was an incredibly hard project. They just couldn't do it. And so the whole thing collapses in 1889, right? At this point, I think it's important to, how many of you are familiar with the famous history book by Jackson Turner, The Significance of the American Frontier in American History? It was a really famous book at the turn of the 19th century, and how the frontier was now over, and the United States needed to look abroad. They needed a vigorous foreign policy to expand their influence into primarily the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And that, with another series of books that were published at the same time by Alfred Mahan, about the importance of sea power in the world, and that sea power was the key to becoming a superpower, right? And both of these were proponents of a very aggressive foreign policy in the Caribbean and Central America, both. I think when we start talking about the Panama Canal, it's really inseparable from the Spanish-American War. And if you guys remember your history, the Spanish-American War was essentially fought in Cuba, right, between Spain and the United States, and it was over what was going to happen in Cuba. The Cuban revolutionaries, the Mambises, were on the verge, actually, of achieving independence from the United States because of the explosion of the Maine, which was in the harbor down in Havana at the time, was the spark for the U.S. getting involved in the Spanish-American War, invading Cuba, fighting the Spanish, defeating the Spanish in Cuba, defeating the Spanish in the Philippines, and acquiring what's looked to be like the landmarks of an imperial kind of possessions with, Cuba is now no longer a Spanish colony. It is ceded over as an independent country, but it's under the impositions of the Platt Amendment, which the United States pushes through the Cuban Congress. And at the time, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904 states that the United States will not hesitate to intervene in any of these Caribbean or Latin American countries when there's a reason to do so. It was mostly, the wording of it was mostly about collecting debt, but it also has language about policing and keeping order in the Caribbean and Central America. So the Spanish-American War, with the acquisition of Puerto Rico as essentially a territory of the United States, complete control of the Cuban economy, the Philippines are now under the U.S. control, and the island of Guam, the need for a link or a way to move through the Caribbean and into the Pacific becomes even more of an imperative. So at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, who had actually fought in the Spanish-American War, you've probably heard the tales about the Rough Riders, but he's the president, early 19th, 20th century, right? And this was his, I think probably from what I've read, his biggest goal was to build a canal. It just was gonna get done, whatever it took. How are you gonna do that? Well, you have to create a treaty process with Colombia, because Panama is part of Colombia. Nicaragua at the time had a very nationalist leader, Jose Santos Zelaya, who was not amenable to forging a treaty with the United States because he was against the idea of a canal zone. With the proposal for a canal came the idea of a canal zone. That means you build a canal when you have a 10-mile stretch of land on either side of the canal that's controlled entirely as a colonial enclave by the United States. That was the proposal that was sent to Nicaragua. It was rejected. So it was sent to Colombia, where the president of Colombia, President Marroquin, accepts it. Teddy Roosevelt is ecstatic, but there was a snag. It didn't pass the Colombian Congress. They saw it as a violation of national sovereignty to cede this strip of land, which would then become a colonial part of the United States. It's no longer Colombia. It would be part of the United States. So the Colombian Congress rejects it, and so the United States, Teddy, it doesn't matter, we're going to do this. And so this is interesting too, that, you know, there were in Panama, even since it's the middle of the 19th century, there were independence movements that wanted to sever from Colombia. They were the furthest province away from Bogota. It was hard to get to. You had to go up to the north coast and sail to Colón back on the Caribbean side. There was no road through the Darien Gap, which we know about now because of migration, so or immigration. So there was a plan hatched to instigate a rebellion among Colombians that wanted independence from Bogota or from Colombia, northern South America. A rebellion happened, and when the Colombians sent ships to try and repress it or put it down, suppress it, the United States had created a blockade on the Colombian side and the colonial side of Panama to make it impossible for the Colombians to come in and put down the rebellion. Quickly, the rebellion succeeded. The United States quickly, the same day, recognized Panama as an independent country. Treaties were signed, and the canal authorization was in place. Now, that didn't mean it was easy to build. I mean, it took almost, it was 1903 when this happened. It was almost over 10 years to build. They almost gave up. It was such an incredibly difficult engineering feat to do it. And they got it done by 1914. It was the crown, and some claim it as the crown achievement of, you know, modern. The United States has created this incredible project that is, the culmination of which is, you know, the transoceanic movement. Anyway, that's how Panama becomes a country. Now, you know, we have Panamanian students here, and I'm sure they're very proud of their country, and the way it achieved independence is a little shady, but it's still it's an independent country, and it had a high degree of autonomy, even when it was part of Colombia. But if you talk to a Colombian, they may have a different take on it, right? It's a part of our country that was stolen by the United States, so a canal could be built. It's important. It's part of Central America because it's an enormous part of the story of, you know, United States Central American relations in the 20th century. There is, at the same time in the early 20th century, we're now into the 20th century, there's this growing sort of push toward investment throughout the Caribbean and Central America, extending the reach of economic power within the United States all throughout the region. One of the countries, again, that is affected most, I think, most by this is Nicaragua, who had a very independent leader, Jose Santos Zelaya, who was not willing to give just concessions to any U.S. company that wanted to come down and, you know, extract mahogany or do banana plantations or, you know, do mining in Nicaragua. He was more, I think, in favor of national figures doing that. And that didn't go well with Philander Knox, who was a statesman at the time, and they began to vilify Zelaya, you know, as we've vilified people throughout our 20th century foreign policy. We did it to Noriega, you know, we did it to Saddam Hussein. I mean, this was the same thing they did to him in the press. Anyway, he saw that he was not going to be able to survive this. He eventually resigns, and the United States assumes an incredible amount of economic control over Nicaragua. They could control the customs houses, all the utilities, all the banks in Nicaragua were controlled by the United States. There are certain factions in Nicaragua that are opposed to this. They see it as high-handed imperialism, and one of them was a well-known peasant leader who, from a little town in Iquinomo, named Augusto Cesar Sandino, and he mobilizes a peasant force to fight against the United States' influence in his country. It was kind of like Emilio Aguinaldo in the Philippines did the same thing. And anyway, he fought against the U.S. Marines. The Marines were in and out of Nicaragua constantly from about 1915 all the way up to the end of the 20s, fighting against Sandino, trying to secure, you know, stability for U.S. investments in Nicaragua. So he fights against it. And at the time, it's interesting, there's so much intervention. We don't have time to get into all the interventions in the Caribbean and Central America in this short talk, but it was, you know, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, in Panama. There was intervention in several other places, Cuba, several interventions in Cuba. But the United States in the 20s begins to tire of this pattern of intervention. And it's called, during the Teddy Roosevelt period, it was called the big stick. You carry a big stick and show that we will police this region and make the region safe for business interests, which are our own primarily. Nicaragua fought against that with Sandino. They fought against that. Finally, by the end of the 20s, there's an exhaustion in the United States of this kind of constant intervention, and so there is a new idea, which is let's not intervene, let's create a constabulary force to protect our interests, which is where you get the idea of a national guard that will do the United States bidding and protect interests within these countries without the need to intervene as much, right? So a lot of this is about repaying loans. Some of it's just about disorder on the street. Anything that looked threatening or destabilizing could be conceived as a potentially dangerous situation. Send in the Marines. Let's clean this up. And it happened, probably over 20 times in Central America and the Caribbean at this time. At the time, there's this new kind of model that emerges at this time in the 30s. Even if we're not going to the United States is not going to intervene in these countries, well, we will at least have a strong man, an authoritarian figure that will, protect the interests of the United States. There's a series of compliant proxies who are willing to basically impose authoritarian rule, not allow democratic spaces to emerge, repress the attempt to form unions, things like this, so that U.S. interests can thrive. There's a whole list of them. I don't have to go through them. I can name them, whether it's Estrada Cabrera in Guatemala, Jorge Ubico in Guatemala, Tiburcio Andino Carillas in Honduras, Somoza, who was actually a dynastic leader because his sons took over after he was assassinated in the 1950s, that rule these places. Hernandez Martinez in El Salvador, and they all had this similarity. They would cater to U.S. interests at the expense of movement toward democracy in their own countries. This continues at the Cold War, but it also brings us to the term that we often is associated with this period, which is Banana Republic. Anybody here know what a Banana Republic is? Everybody's heard the term. There's even a line of clothing, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Joe?
I was just saying.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's essentially, in this context, the Banana Republic is a politically unstable, very poor country that depends on usually one crop for export and foreign investment, and takes on a very submissive attitude towards the United States in terms of foreign policy. It's a pejorative term. I remember it being used after the January 6th thing. What do we become, a Banana Republic? So the idea of, instability, disorder, chaos, governance without consensus, just, the mob rules, that's all embedded in the term Banana Republic, which showed up first in the writer O. Henry's book, Cabbage and Kings, in which he talks about a mythical country called Anchuria, in which there's banana republics are part of the landscape, right? This really, the idea of the Banana Republic is a reality. Because, in the late 19th century, some of these entrepreneurial types like Sam Zamouret, the banana man, get the idea that we can grow bananas in Central America or the Caribbean and sell them at a very, high profit in the United States if we can get this launched. And so Cuyamel fruit first starts in the Caribbean and Central America, and then it merges with United Fruit. But the idea behind the United Fruit Company, which emerges at this time, first part of the 20th century, is really the first United States transnational corporation. And you don't realize that, but it really was incredibly powerful. They had fleets of ships that would, take the bananas from the coast of Central America up to New Orleans. And they were kind of, the ultimate paradigmatic representation of U.S. imperialism in Central America. Some have even posited that they maintained authoritarian, the presence of the Banana Republic with the United Fruit Companies behind them sort of impeded the possibilities of democracy or anti-authoritarian governments emerging, right? You could go down the list. You could talk about Minor Keith in Costa Rica, who was the representative for the United Fruit Company that helped build the railroad from Puerto Limon up to San Jose. There was Sam Samurai in Honduras, and he brought renegades down there to overthrow a president so that they would give more attractive concessions to the UFCO or the fruit companies. So the whole idea of the Banana Republic kind of underlies this period of U.S. imperialism. UFCO was in Guatemala, of course Honduras, Nicaragua, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama all at the same time. Made tremendous profits, and they were given concessions to build railroads, to build infrastructure, highways, telegraph systems, and everything, so that they could acquire more land to expand their empire. Okay, what I'm going to move to now is how the U.S. support for despotic or authoritarian regimes throughout the early 20th century and into the Cold War period after the Second World War eventually culminate in massive amounts of immigration from Central America to the United States. I use a book in my class on the United States, or Hispanics in the United States, called Harvested Empire by Juan Gonzalez, which you've read and you took the class. And you remember the thesis of the book, that the countries from which the majority of immigrants are coming, Central America and the Caribbean, are the countries where the United States has had more political, economic, and cultural influence. So there's this kind of axiomatic, cause and effect thesis within the book. And I think what I want to talk about, I do buy into that. I think that's a pretty decent and a defensible thesis, the way he lays it out in the book. And this support for authoritarian regimes throughout this period eventually will result in massive movement of peoples out of Central America to the United States later on during the Civil War period during the 1980s, which is when the Civil War started in Central America. During the 1980s, and I remember them very well because I spent a lot of time in Central America in the 1980s. I spent months and months and months in all of the countries, mostly in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. But during the 80s, I remember public knowledge about Central America and these conflicts that were raging was very scant at best. Most saw the Central America as just another theater in the worldwide battle between, democracy and communism, and that there was the good guys and the bad guys, and we were on the good side, and we were supporting the guys that were going to try and save democracy in Central America, and Cuba and the Soviet Union were supporting the bad guys, and we had to win this epic struggle, right? This view was very limited, very short-sighted, very shallow, and it didn't take into account the autonomy of revolutionary movements in Central America that actually go back to the 20s and 30s, way before Cuba was even an appendage of the Soviet Union, nor the huge and festering class divisions that were wreaking havoc in Central America because the countries weren't making any progress economically in terms of elimination of poverty. And so our role in supporting governments that were status quo, that didn't want to see change, that didn't want to see improvement, that didn't want to see democratic movements take root, are they are to blame in large measure for the outbreak of these wars and the subsequent immigration to the United States. So, to understand, I think, really the movement of people, displacement of peoples during the 1980s from Central America, in the Northern Triangle countries anyway, you have to understand primarily in Guatemala and El Salvador how U.S. was complicit. First, we'll say that the U.S. was, and this was probably the most egregious example, was complicity in Nicaragua, which didn't produce near as many immigrants to the United States, but most of them went to Costa Rica, which was right next door, of supporting a dictatorial, very despotic, authoritarian dynasty of the Somozas since the 1930s all the way up to the 70s. And just digging in and supporting the dictator, you thought we'd learned our lesson with Batista, who was overthrown by Castro in 1959. It didn't happen. The Sandinista movement, which was started in the early 60s by Carlos Fonseca and Silvio Mayorga, were not just copies of Cuba. They were very much in line with what Nicaragua was thinking ideologically at the time. They didn't receive any support from Cuba early on. Eventually, by the 70s, after a really horrible earthquake in Managua in 1972, and the pillaging by the Somoza dictatorship of all of the international aid that flows into Managua at the time, which is the story behind Roberto Clemente's death, if any of you are interested in that, causes a tremendous exodus once the Sandinistas take over. There's an exodus to the north, to Honduras, and to the south, to Costa Rica. But primarily it's the United States that supported a dictator for 40 years with the apocryphal term, well, he's an SOB, but he's ours, which is generally assigned to Somoza, and I don't know if FDR really said that. It's probably it's just an example of the attitude of support. In El Salvador, during the 30s and 40s, the U.S. Was complicit by silence or looking the other way, right? By not really challenging or putting any pressure on authoritarian regimes that were gaining more and more power through the 40s by letting the coffee oligarchy take more and more peasant land during the 40s. This had started in the 1880s, the usurpation of peasant lands during the Liberals regime in the 1880s and 90s. But it actually picks up steam in the 40s and 50s and 60s and causes a whole lot of Salvadorans to actually have to go up to Honduras to work on the banana plantations. And that's part of the reason we have the famous soccer war of 1968, right? But the United States stays with El Salvador in spite of the fact they had very fraudulent elections in two occasions in the 1970s. And this eventually leads to people saying, well, heck, we can't, we've tried democracy, we've tried to elect leaders that are going to implement institutionalized reforms that are sorely needed in our country. There's no way we can do it. The oligarchy has control of the country with the military. The United States does nothing. That's why you eventually have a guerrilla war that erupts in 1980. What happens when there's a guerrilla war in 1980? Tens of thousands of Salvadorans head to California. This is well documented. This is the seedbed of the gangs that eventually come back to Central America in the late 90s and early 2000s to create the Maras and all of that problematic that we see later. But this exodus in the 80s from El Salvador is really significant. It's extremely significant because it creates one of the fastest growing diaspora, Central American diaspora in the United States at the time. And as I say, in LA, the potential for gang violence actually grows exponentially. And once deportations start under Bill Clinton in the 90s, all of the ingredients for gangs growth in Central America are there. In Guatemala, also, we see many errors, horrible errors, terrible We see a spring, an uprising in 1944 by unions and intellectuals to overthrow the dictator of Jorge Ubico. That's called La Primavera de 44. And Guatemala experiences a democratic emergence as a democratic country. And they have a tremendous leader, Jose Juan Arevalo, who's elected in a landslide, and he begins to put into place these reforms that come out of, that were somewhat modeling the New Deal's reforms, like Social Security, like a decent wage for a limited amount of time you have to work, retirement. These basic ideas that we take for granted that Guatemala didn't have, and he begins to implement these. His successor is a military man, Jacobo Arbenz, who comes in and is also democratically elected by a large margin in 1950, I believe, yes, 50. And he tries to address one of the fundamental problems of Guatemala, which is land tenure. When you have a country that has really, really fertile soil, because a lot of it's volcanic, you have a lot of soil, it's just a lot of really good land in Guatemala at the time, but where 2% of the population owns 72% of the really good land, you have a problem of land tenure, especially when you have a population that is eminently campesino, the people that work the land with their hands for subsistence. So this is a real problem. He tried to do something with his decree, 900 decree, in 1953, which was to not expropriate land under cultivation from the United Fruit Company. It was to only expropriate land that was idle land that was not under cultivation, that the fruit company said they needed in case there was a hurricane or something. And so, they are recompensated for the land at the cost for the taxes they paid on it. I mean, there was a formula that they used. Well, at the time, people say, well, this is the Cold War. You can't do something like this. This is communism. You can't expropriate a fruit company's land in a foreign country. Well, at the time, John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and Allen Dulles was the chief of the CIA, the head of the CIA, and they both had tremendous stock holdings in the United Fruit Company. So we'll start there. From there, a coup is organized surreptitiously, clandestinely. Rebels are organized along the Honduran border near Esquipulas, and the United States threatens Arbenz and begins to strafe bomb the capital. And finally, he says, instead of fighting for it, I'm just going to resign. I don't want to bring the Guatemalan people into a war with the United States. It's not worth it. We will not win it. And he has to resign. Okay, it's interesting. Che Guevara was in Guatemala at that time. He was coming through, and it's in his memoirs about what he perceived during the Arbenz period at the time. Okay, what's the result of overthrowing an Arbenz, a democratically elected president that was supported by the great majority of the people? Well, 31 years of authoritarian and military rule, massive human rights abuses, probably the worst in Central America, genocidal policies against Mayan villages during the first years of the early 80s years during the Civil War, and huge amounts of military hardware sent in by the United States to maintain the status quo and to thwart the advance of communism in Central America. Remember, at the same time, the Sandinistas are in control in Nicaragua. They're being harassed by contras, which are financed by the United States at the same time, many of whom were ex-Somocistas. And there was the charge, when Ronald Reagan commissions Henry Kissinger to create a very exhaustive report on what the heck is going on in Central America and how we're going to fix this. The Kissinger Commission report comes out in 1983, and its emissions are incredible. One of the things it says is there's never been any homegrown revolutionary movements in Central America. There have been all the way back to the 20s. That this is all a fabrication. This is all coming from Cuba and the Soviet Union. nothing has happened in Central America except, ideological and logistical help to the Sandinistas and to the Salvadoran rebels and to those in Guatemala also. But it's that Kissinger Commission report and neglected a lot of things. It was I don't know if you guys remember the Reagan years, but it was mainly the solution in Central America to the civil wars is not a negotiated power sharing agreement. It's it's got to be a military solution. That was the mindset up until the mid-'80s when the Contadora group starts up and they finally forge some treaties in the late '80s, which are signed in the '90s. Now, I think it's interesting that these interventions in Central America, or these, lack of any kind of criticism of authoritarianism, actually really create these incredibly large diasporas that are Central American. The Salvadoran one is the greatest, is the largest, followed by Guatemalans. And the Honduran diaspora is growing really, really fast. And it's not as related to U.S. foreign policy as the others, but we could link it to the 2008 coup against Mel Zelaya. That's a little bit outside the scope of this, but I think there's linkage there. The U.S. supported throughout these years military coups, corporate plundering, economic, environmental degradation through the CAFTA agreement, which are Central American Free Trade Agreements, which generally give the neoliberal model carte blanche to go into these countries and do extractionist kinds of exercises with international companies that disregard the needs and the environmental safeties that need to be put in place. All of these things that I just mentioned create structures that have embedded themselves in Central America even today, causing the people of the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to immigrate in greater and greater numbers. These military interventions and economic liberalism have created also, I believe, power vacuums in Central America that have been filled by drug cartels who are now in collusion with political leaders. The case of Guatemala is probably the most, and Honduras with the ex-president Orlando Hernandez, who's now under indictment, or I think he's in jail in the United States, as his brother is, for being the evangelical narco dictador. And this is a real problem. So what I'm trying to get at is that a lot of this support or lack of criticism or lack of interest in Central America have really, these decisions, these foreign policy decisions, have had a destabilizing effect on Central America, and that's inextricably linked to increased immigration in the last 15 or 20 years. Let's talk about Sam Walton for a minute, because he inserts himself right into this picture, right? Sam knew some Panamanian bankers, one in particular, and he became interested in the early 80s in the Central American conflicts. He visited Panama, talked to people, and became convinced that the problem is, one of the huge problems in Central America is the Nicaraguan Revolution and the Sandinistas programs and the exportation of their ideology and their support for guerrilla groups in El Salvador and Guatemala. So that to him was a problem. Mostly also the fact that in Nicaragua in the early 80s, the Sandinistas were sending students, just like you guys, to the Soviet bloc, to Romania, to Bulgaria, to Yugoslavia and other Eastern Bloc countries to receive technical training. That scandalized Sam. He said, no, wait a minute. We can't have students from Nicaragua going to study a technical career in Bulgaria. That's a threat. This is our patio. So he comes up and he looked at the Kissinger Commission's report on Central America, and one of the recommendations within the Kissinger Commission report was that student scholarships be created for Central American students to come study free enterprise and democracy in the United States. Two things that the perception was they were sorely lacking in Central America, which was probably true. Anyway, Sam This recommendation within the Kissinger Commission report said this should be a government program, but as we know, Sam didn't need the money from the government. Sam decided to do this on his own. He decided to create this program for the 3 beneficiary schools in Arkansas, John Brown, Harding, and University of Ozarks, because of his affiliation with the Presbyterians, and Helen's endearment with the University of Ozarks. And so this program was created and implemented in 1985. It's interesting, when I was doing the WISE program back in 2015, we brought a writer in who's written like 9 incredible books. Stephen Kinzer, look him up. He was New York Times foreign correspondent in Nicaragua for 7 years. He's written books on Turkey, Iran. He's an amazing writer. Books on, it's Teddy Roosevelt and Mark Twain. He's got a great book on those two. They were contemporaries. And he was here on campus signing his books. We had him speak. He had a great book on the new book on the Dulles brothers, Alan and John Foster Dulles, and a lot of the involvement in the coup in '54 in Guatemala. And anyway, these students, the Walton scholarship students, were lining up to have the book signed. And Stephen said, hey, you Walton students, you ought to thank Nicaragua for the fact that there's a Walton scholarship, because if the Sandinistas hadn't sent their kids to the Eastern Bloc, there would be no Walton scholarship. And the kids like, really? I mean, what is he talking about? And then, when you think about it and research it, it makes perfect sense. That was the primary impetus, was the perceived threat of Nicaraguan students going to the Eastern Bloc. Now, one other thing, I don't know how we're doing on time. Probably getting close, yeah. One other thing that, is fueling immigration from Central America is the fact that it started in the 80s, right? And it is increased and more because once a diaspora sets down roots, what do they do with a lot of their money? In the case of the Central American diasporas, send it home. They're called remittances or remesas, right? So this, in turn, is another part of the attraction. It's that once you have a diaspora in place and remittances are sent and remesas are going home, and little towns like Todos Santos and Huehuetenango see that the neighbor's got a big house, where is this coming from? Well, my 2 sons are up in California working construction. Are you kidding? I'm headed that way. It's that you see it all over the place. That is something that incentivizes poor people in Central America to immigrate, because not enough is being done to address problems of abject poverty in these countries. And I'm not really a huge fan of the United States just giving away billions of dollars, because a lot of it is not going to make it to those people. I think these remittances are probably the best way to help Central Americans in Central America. I'm not a huge fan of the United States to give a lot of aid. It's not effective. I think a lot of it's siphoned off, and it's just not going to work. A couple of contemporary notes before we open up for questions and comments. Couple of things that happen in Central America today. First, the move toward China. Every country except Guatemala and Central America has actually broken ties with Taiwan, recognized China, and has opened up diplomatic relations with China. It's not an ideological thing at all. It's about money. It's about funding infrastructure projects. That's what it's about. The United States doesn't like it. No, they tried to talk Xiomara Castro in Honduras from signing off with Xi in China for a rapprochement, and they're now, all the countries are moving that way. They built the soccer stadium in Costa Rica. Nicaragua signed on with them as well. I see dictatorship and authoritarianism in Nicaragua. It seems to be very deep-rooted and problematic. Don't know how that's going to work out. I see encroaching authoritarianism in El Salvador and Bukele. I know he's been heralded as this great champion that, that destroyed the Maras and, has brought peace to El Salvador, but at what cost? I don't know. He's trying to re-elect himself when it's not in the Constitution. He's put people in jails for having tattoos and things like that. Somewhat problematic. I think the election of Bernardo Arevalo in Guatemala is a very positive development. Whether he will be allowed to take office is still kind of up in the air. Let's hope that there's enough international pressure on some of these forces like the Attorney General that want to do all the chicanery and stuff that keep him from assuming the presidency. We'll see what happens. So I see some optimism there in Guatemala. In Honduras, I think, with Hernandez gone and Castro in, it's a move in the right direction. I know she's not very popular now in Honduras, but we'll see how that comes out. Okay, that's all I want to say. Anyone have a comment, a criticism, a refutation, maybe a comment? Yes.
Why do you hate the U.S. so much?
Why do you hate America? Yeah. No, I don't. I just think that there's been a lot of foreign policy blunders. And
yeah.
I just think there's been a high-handedness, like an attitude toward Latin America that go back all the way to the founding fathers, which has been, this is part of our sphere, and we're going to do what we want to maintain hegemony. I think the historical record pretty much bears it out.
A more technical or specific question is when you were talking about the students going to the Eastern Bloc for technical education, you emphasized that it was for technical education.
That's the adjective that always is attached to it. I don't think it was for ideological reasons.
Right, they're not going there to import communism. They're going there to learn.
To learn a trade, yeah. Well, it is interesting to bring that up. My brother-in-law is Nicaraguan. He spent 6 years in the Soviet Union training to be a MiG pilot. So, that's just kind of emblematic. It just speaks to the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a strange thing to be studying now. Never got to use it, of course. Anything else? Yes, Joe. Go ahead.
You go first.
Go ahead.
I am interested, thank you for this research. I am very interested in the criticism and the emergency of new concepts that didn't exist, like diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Before that age, it didn't exist. Even the human rights is from the 60s,
mm-hmm.
but still take time to apply. And after the massacres in Salvador and Guatemala and this diaspora and this humanitarian aid and waking up of this thing, concepts like diversity, respect start to emerge. Now that with more modern perspective in the history, social studies and everything, how do you think that the study of those the functional economic motivation that it's only money that destroyed the society could help to raise those other concepts?
I'm not sure. I remember in the 80s that there was a lot of solidarity work being done in Central America by people here in the United States. The CISPAS group, Citizens in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, they put a lot of pressure on the Reagan administration to make changes in foreign policy, some of which were somewhat helpful in spite of what Oliver North did at the conference. There were some movement in that direction. In terms of where this, I think there's a greater awareness of things that are happening in Central America today. In the 80s, it was just print media. Some of these places were very hard to cover for journalists, extremely hard to cover. I remember visiting a town in Guatemala where apparently called the Paxtu, Huehuetenango, where apparent massacre had taken place, and we went to this town and nobody wanted to talk, and everybody was scared. They scarcely spoke Spanish, and this was really hard to cover. It's like kind of covering Vietnam in some ways, but I think things have changed a lot since then. I think there's an opportunity to, to really, especially in Guatemala with the new president, I think that we can do some really good things there. I think he's been, everything that I read about him is fairly positive. Kind of came out of nowhere. Nobody thought he had a chance. But Joe, did you want to say something?
The previous I took your class, I'm very happy that a lot of the knowledge that you taught me stuck with me, and that class has like fueled that fire for me to learn about Central and Latin America in general. I was just wondering, have you ever thought about maybe offering another course that like delves deeper into specific countries?
Oh, I'd love to. I don't know if that's going to be possible, but yeah, a dream course would be just a course on Central America. That to me would be a course that I'd really like to teach. In fact, if I teach Latin American next semester, I may just do that. Now that you say that, I think that's a great idea. I may just say, okay, I don't, because I've been doing Mexico, Cuba, Central America, and Chile in the last 2 years anyway, doing the revolutions. But I may just do Central America because it is a region that,
Very, very dense.
Yeah, oh, very, very
A lot of
dense.
information.
It's endless. It's endless. The complexities are endless. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Sorry, I have 2 questions.
Sure.
If that's okay. First one is from a friend of mine. Said, did Sam Walton ever write a memoir or anything similar where he reflected on starting the Walton Scholarship?
I think it's in his book. Yes. I didn't go back and look. Probably should after this talk, but he does reflect on that. Yes. I think it. One of the amazing things about the scholarship, is that when the Cold War ended in '91, many thought that the plug would be pulled on it because it really is a development of the Cold War, right? But the Waltons seemed to be really prescient, knowing that Central America was still in need of these sort of programs, and that they could assist Central America in the future. This was well before, he died before to see the whole problem of the gangs explode in the early 2000s. So yeah, the very fact that they've kept it, the continuity is there, to me is remarkable. And the enrichment is not only for Central America, it's for us.
Yeah.
It's not only that the Central American kids that come here to study are the beneficiaries of the scholarship. We here at this school are the beneficiaries because we have this incredible amount of, enrichment by our Central American population on campus that are there's a wealth of knowledge within those kids. There's another one.
Yeah. This one's more of a personal question. I'm not like a scholar on the subject, so forgive me if this is a little, if this isn't my place. The Dole Fruit Company contributed a lot to the banana wars.
Who did?
The Dole Fruit Company.
Dole fruit, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things sold at Walmart are bananas and fruit.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you say to the argument that maybe some of this money towards a scholarship kind of belongs to Central America?
Well, you're probably right. I think they see it as a human investment in students in their development and preparation for careers that ideally will take place in Central America and aid those countries through time. I think it's sort of an investment. That money is seen as a human investment in the potential for growth. You probably want to ask me how effective I think the Walton Scholarship is in achieving the goals.
I won't push too hard. I feel bad asking the question.
I think it does some definite good at the micro level, maybe at the community level. It's certainly helped families. I don't think, however, that the Walton Scholarship is nearly enough to penetrate the economic and political structures of Central America to change them. Those are so deeply rooted that a Walton Scholarship is not going to change those things. Unfortunately, but maybe some. Who knows?
Maybe with the accumulation.
Yeah, it's been in place for 40 years, coming up on 40 years. So, no, I don't want to impugn the scholarship at all. I think it's been a great thing for Central America and for Ozarks and these other universities here in Arkansas. So, I mean, really remarkable. I just
for me. I was a director for 2 years and had incredible experiences and just saw a side to it that was unreal.
Thank you very
Go
much.
ahead.
So in your closing remarks, you talk about El Salvador's president and how he starts throwing people in jail for wearing tattoos. And for me, at least from what I know, from his experiences and what he's done for El Salvador, is that he's helped the country a lot lower its violence
Sure,
and
absolutely.
the amount of gangs in the country.
Sure.
So why minimize it and define it as, you know, throwing people in jail for having tattoos?
Well, I'm kind of an advocate for habeas corpus. You know, I believe if you're going to throw somebody in jail, there's got to be a reason for it. If you're wearing a tattoo, I don't think that's a reason for it. I think a lot of these people that were imprisoned never know. Some of them were probably gang. A good many of them were probably gang members.
Yeah, there's a lot of them that are journalists that are being put in, and he's using Pegasus from Israel to like spy on everyone.
I just, I have problems. Yeah, I have problems with Kelly because I think he's showing signs of becoming authoritarian. I understand, that he's improved the situation dramatically. I agree with you. I would not dispute that. The way he's done it, I'm not so sure I agree with that, nor do I think his movement toward authoritarianism is a good thing. I think he's kind of slick. I think he's kind of, one of these young guys that wants to show off. I don't think his dabbling in cryptocurrency is a good idea for El Salvador. So I think I'm ambivalent. I think yes, you're right. He has improved the security situation in El Salvador dramatically, but there are other things about him that I find problematic. Yes. Yeah.
Bill, could you talk about your experience at the border and also in the court systems?
Yeah.
Well, one of the takeaways from our conversations was your challenge. You've got English, Spanish, I don't know what other languages under your belt, and it was still challenging because you're dealing with Indigena, you're dealing with multiple languages, the challenge of that. Just sharing your experience would be.
Well, I went to the border twice to work at a migrant shelter. Because I really had a deep kind of identification with people that were leaving Central America and Mexico because of any number of reasons. They could be environmental, they could be climate, they could be persecution, they could be just tremendous poverty, any number of family violence or whatever. But working at the border was a fantastic experience. I worked with one of the founders of these migrant shelters who'd been there for 30 years. He started out in the 80s when the first Central Americans were coming out. Many of the people I talked to were Brazilian. I used my Portuguese some, but mainly Spanish, and you saw a lot of Cubans coming through Central America, Mexicans, people fleeing gang violence and drug-related violence. Mayan indigenous women bringing 2-year-old children, just incredible stories. So I think it was an amazing experience. I'd do it again if I could. I think the situation at the border has gotten more complicated. I don't think you can do that as easily anymore. As far as the court work goes, most of my court work is with undocumented people, and it's been a pleasure to work with helping them have equal access to the justice system and not charging them anything. You don't know how many times people say, well, how much do I owe you for this? No, the state of Arkansas pays for this. So I think that's been enriching, is keeping in contact with people that are undocumented here, that are here for reasons that I think are completely legitimate, totally legitimate. And I'd like to see their status be upgraded. But that's me. That's my opinion. So I do think immigration is going to be a huge issue in the next year's election. And I think a lot of what's said about immigration is hyperbolic. You can't even really talk about the situation at the border without using the word crisis. There's just this sort of, the world is, the sky is falling mentality associated with it. when, you know, this is happening all over the world. This is global South moving north. It's not just the United States. Maybe we do need to you know, tweak our asylum laws or change some law. I mean, I understand that, but this is going to be with us for some time. This is not something that's going away. This is global South moving north. People have been on the move for millenniums, 10,000 years, and you know, when resources are scarce, people are going to move, and so there's no stopping this. You're just going to have to figure out ways to deal with it more efficiently. I believe that's just my perception. You can't build a wall and say we're going to stop it. No, that's not it. That's not what it's about. It's not about that. Anyone else? Yes, Chris.
So thanks for the great talk.
Oh, thank you.
I want to try out some of the terminology that you introduced to me tonight. So, would you say that the Panama Canal is a kind of terramorphic filibuster?
Terramorphic filibuster. That's an interesting use of language. So, what exactly do you mean?
Like, it's almost like the United States was like, all right, we'd love to go down here and just take Manifest Destiny and turn it south, and just take over everything.
Mhm.
But that seems very difficult. We're not. This sounds like it's going to be too hard to try to make actual colonies down here.
Uh-huh.
So instead, what we're going to do is instantiate these kind of, revolutions with our own impetus, and then make this kind of, in Panama, this almost kind of like anti-colony. We're going to turn part of the country into another country.
True.
Then we're going to turn that land into water, and we're going to make that our sort of eminent domain by which we can then expand globalization in that way instead of through traditional colonization.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that's an interesting point that this talk didn't get into the opposition by the Panamanians to the canal and the presence and the canal zone and the enclave nature of it, and you know, the way North Americans discriminated against Panamanians all over the place and got away with all kinds of things in this demonstration in the early 60s, which culminated in, you know, blood being spilled on Panamanian soil because they wanted for the Panamanian flag to be flown with the American flag. Yeah, that's a huge, I mean, that's a more theoretical question, yeah. You're probably right. I think that the Panama Canal not only served as like a reminder that we are the preeminent technological power in the world for engineering some feat like this, but also that, you know, this is the coronation of our empire, of imperialism that links the Pacific to the Caribbean. And, you know, it's becoming obsolete. You know, the canal is not what it used to be. It can't accommodate the bigger ships now. And recently, a few years ago, when we brought Sergio Ramirez here to talk as a Weiss guest, the whole conversation was about Nicaragua building a canal to compete with the Panama Canal, and the Chinese were going to finance it. Right? This was in about 2014. And that idea eventually dissipated and didn't get carried through with. But yeah, terramorphic. Yeah, that's a good one. I like that.
It's like a colonization by other means.
Colonization by other means. Yeah. Yeah, it's, you know, the canal zone is no longer the canal zone. My mother grew up in the canal zone, so I grew up around stuff in the canal zone, and it was this incredibly isolated little piece of Panama that was like, just, this is the U.S. They had federal courts there. They had a U.S. court system was in place there. You know, it was the Panamanians. The only Panamanians that really went there were either dignitaries or people that washed Americans' clothes. You know, that's essentially what the canal zone was at Balboa or what right? Yeah, you're Panamanian.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming out. Appreciate it.
I have another comment.
Yeah.
This is not new from the United States that use of the rationale to implant or to expand the economic power, because the anti-slavery movement in Latin America start by England people that want to sell machines instead of use human force. They start, they support, they make wars, and they support the laws. Because they want to sell machines. Then there is a rationale that will expand. But what we learn from this process is very important. I think that after every tragedy there is a reverse, and learn how to develop criticism. Now we have a youth more critical and that question everything. And my father told me, we didn't grow with that. We obey everything. We obey. We never question anything. Part of the evolution, part of the society. I don't know, but I would like to be positive after this talk. Learn, yes, this history is nice, but it's our history. And change what we want to do after we embrace the problems that could be to apply or to serve only the economic theories instead of the ethic. The ethic.
I don't. I do think that our students at Ozarks should be aware of these things.
I think there should be a baseline of understanding about, Central America. We are tied to Central America, culturally, politically, in many, many ways, historically. And,
U.S. in general, but uniquely.
Yeah, uniquely here because of the Walton Scholarship, and I just think that the kids should take courses in this, or become curious and discover things on their own. I mean, the information's out there. If you want to take a course, I'll package it for you and make it a little more accessible. But no, I mean, I will put it in a framework that's workable. Is what I mean. You know what I mean? But another problem, though, is that for us, I have to teach most of my classes, all my classes in Spanish, and that shuts out a lot of the kids that would normally have access, unless they take the Hispanics in the U.S. class like Joe did, and we do get into a lot of these discussions because we look at the origins of.
No, I think it's on other professors too to try to be more broad in their content.
How many kids here could put all the countries of Central America on a map in this?
How many professors?
Well, I really appreciate you guys coming out. I mean, this kind of stuff means a lot to me. It has since the 70s. I've been in this since the 70s, really. This is what I live in, and when it turns to things that I like to study. And your presence here made me feel welcome. It made me feel at ease, and I put together this little talk tonight, thinking about how I could reach some students maybe that didn't know very much about this. Maybe make them think about things in a different way. Maybe it was stuff that you already knew. I don't know. Some of it was probably knowledge at an intuitive level.
I had to Google William Walker.
Oh, you didn't know about William Walker?
No. I mean, I did a little bit. I think we actually had a book on him, but I didn't
Oh,
know the details. So.
Yeah, he's
Wikipedia.
quite the paradigmatic, filibuster.
Yeah. Incredibly well educated, doctor, lawyer.
Guy spoke about 5
businessman.
languages.
Heidelberg University, Edinburgh University, I mean, he had all the degrees. So, crazy. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. Thank you.